Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 21st, 2020. I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria, and this week we're going to be chatting with an investigative journalist who has a fascinating story to tell. But before we dive into that, I do want to thank those of you who continue to make Talk Nerdy possible week after week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because I heavily rely on the support of those of you who have logged on to patreon.com/talknerdy and pledged your support. I'm making a lot of changes. So I'm making changes to my website. I've moved over to a new hosting provider that allows more functionality. So you might start to notice things like I'm changing the titles of the episodes to make them more interesting, to make them more searchable, and to tell you what we're actually talking about. So far, it seems like there have been no issues with the move over to Spreaker from my old hosting provider. And most people have given me feedback that they didn't have to rescan their feeds or anything. But if for whatever reason you're not finding new episodes, you may need to rescan your feeds. I also still am not sure if I'm fully up on iHeartRadio or Google Podcasts. So if you are running into any issues in those areas, I would love to hear about that. Reach out to me via social media or on Patreon and let me know what you think. Okay, this week I want to thank the top tier patrons, including Michael Gaucher, Mary Neva, Christopher Pitts, June Sapara, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hageman, Dudas Infinitas, Charles Payet, Brian Holden, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Daniel Lang, David J. E. Smith, Robert Christ, and Elise Christie. Thank you guys so freaking much. You guys are awesome. Let's talk about the show. You want to? Let's talk about the show. So this week I'm very lucky to have had the opportunity to sit down with a science writer who also now is working as an investigative reporter for the Intercept, Mara Hvistendahl. And she was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for one of her previous books, Unnatural Selection. Her newest book, guys, it's fascinating. It's called The Scientist and the Spy, a true story of China, the FBI, and industrial espionage. And of course, she tells it better than anyone. So without any further ado, here she is, Mara Hvistendahl. Well, Mara, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
So we're going to talk about your newest book, The Scientist and the Spy, a true story of China, the FBI, and industrial espionage. And that is a lot to unpack. I love when I have authors and, science writers on the show who have a really interesting story to tell, and often one that, my listeners may not have even heard of. So I don't really always know where to start. I think before we dive into the story, because I think that's going to take up most of our time, I would love to just know a little bit about you right here at the top. So you've been a science writer for quite some time, haven't you?
Yeah, I started out as a freelancer in China. I had studied Chinese. And so when I finished journalism school, I just moved to Shanghai and tried my hand at freelancing. And pretty quickly, I fell into science writing. There just weren't a lot of science writers living there at the time. And at that point in my life, I found it really interesting. I got to go on archaeological digs, got to go to coal mines to look at fossils. I went on demographic surveys. It was just, I got to see this whole range of projects that I think most journalists don't get to see. And it was at that point a much more open area for Americans to cover.
Right. Were you doing coverage for American outlets at the time, or were you writing for Chinese outlets?
Oh, no, I wrote for mostly American magazines, Scientific American, most of the major science magazines. And I eventually became a correspondent for Science and then wrote pretty exclusively for them.
And it sounds like a lot of the stories at the time were maybe, I'm not sure of the right word for this, but maybe a little bit more apolitical. Like they were just interesting stories about like you said, geology or geography or like scientific endeavors that were occurring in China, but they weren't necessarily controversial?
Yes and no. I mean, science and technology hadn't yet become the major flashpoint in the US-China relationship that it is today. And so in that sense, I had a lot more access than I might now. And people were much more willing to open up. But, at the same time, the story of development, whether you're talking about economic development or scientific development in China, has two sides. So there's like these great achievements, they're sending people into space. They're building a huge super collider. They've built this amazing telescope. And, on the flip side of that is that there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of cutting corners. And all of that was present at the time that I was reporting. And, as a journalist, I was also drawn to those seedier stories. And then I ended up writing a book about seeds. So of the seedy stories.
I love that. We covered on the other podcast that I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. We've covered a handful of like retraction stories or stories about, I don't know, kind of like unethical or unscrupulous journals and scientific publications coming out of China, where there did seem sometimes to be fewer ethics checks and balances or different standards for publication. But my knowledge beyond those like specific stories that we covered of sort of the culture of Chinese science, to be honest, is really lacking, because on the one hand, I think most of us understand that in a way there really is kind of a technological arms race, and we're seeing amazing, and in some ways unfettered innovation because of the nature of the Chinese government. More things can be done more quickly. But on the other hand, I'm not really sure, or I'm not clear on how the ethical imperatives compare to those here in the U.S.
Right. Well, there are definitely issues with junk papers and paper mills, and in the U.S. and other parts of the world as well. In China, sometimes it's taken to a new level. I did a big investigation when I was at Science into a very elaborate paper mill that involves getting a paper accepted for publication and then bringing on other authors once it had already been accepted at a journal. And those spots could go for, I believe, tens of thousands of dollars. And so it's very lucrative business, and just dozens and dozens of agencies that were offering this service. And so that was one of the stories that I looked at. So at the time that then science and technology started to become this issue that was intertwined with national security concerns, and suddenly, like the concern of the FBI, I was already pretty familiar with this underbelly of Chinese science. But I had also befriended many scientists. There were many very talented people who are working in the U.S., often ethnic Chinese scientists who would go back and forth and really raise the quality of research in China. And, there are many people who are doing these things for the best possible reasons. And so I knew these two sides.
Right. And I think sometimes here in America, we're looking at things through a propaganda filter. Like, I know that, evidence-based journalism is so important and it exists. And, often when we read stories, probably many that you have written about some of the things that are going on, even if the story itself is like somewhat neutral in its reporting, I think many Americans carry a bias, so they're already reading them through that lens.
I would say that's especially true under the Trump administration.
Right.
I guess tensions with China have grown, and as people like Bill Barr and Mike Pompeo have given speech after speech on on communist China and the dangers that it brings to the United States, even as they ignore the Russian threat.
Right. And then, or I guess embrace it. And then you add to that the kind of racist undertone of like the Wuhan flu or the China virus, or even worse things, which I won't say on air, because I would never use those phrases, that we hear kind of repeated with this administration. It just kind of doubles down, I think, on those biases that a lot of Americans carry.
So I've actually been a little shocked. My book came out in February, so right as all of this reporting was coming out of Wuhan about this new virus that was filling hospitals and killing people. And so, it's very much been a COVID book, but I've been surprised with the degree to which some of the themes that I got at in the book about mounting racism, technology as a flashpoint in geopolitics and in the U.S.-China relationship, industrial espionage being used as a justification for lately, like closing a consulate and taking all of these other actions against China. I mean, these were things that were there when I was reporting the book, and that I tried to explore as themes. But in the past few months, they've all very much become realities.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that to me is like what's so interesting, I think, about the story that you tell is that it's almost as much context as it is action. And I think that's always so important when we are learning about things that maybe we have no previous knowledge about. Like, I think a lot of us have an opinion about the context of the geopolitical landscape in which this story that you tell occurred, which obviously we'll get into the story next. But you do such a good job of painting a picture of maybe not a new way, but a varied way or a more fair way to contextualize these issues, instead of saying, this is what happened based on your own, biases or the propaganda that we've been living under for so long. You make the best of it, add to it whatever your emotions are. I think that you really help tell the story in a more equitable way.
Thank you. So at the time that I first read about the case of Robert Moore, who is the protagonist of the book in 2013, the FBI was already investigating dozens of Chinese scientists for industrial espionage. And, often when these people were charged, the issue was being very much couched as a national security threat. And that was part of what interested me in the story. If you look back at the history of the national security apparatus in the U.S., going back to 9/11, there have been lots of situations where there's been threat inflation. And so I wondered if that might be the case with corporate trade secrets theft, because it's not an issue that you have. There's no doubt that it's happening, and there's no doubt that Chinese companies and individuals are stealing trade secrets from American companies. But whether that is a visceral threat to many Americans in the way that far-right extremist groups are, or terrorism is really an open debate. And so that's part of what I want to get into in the book.
Right. So maybe one of the things that we could start by exploring is the concept of espionage. I think a lot of people have heard the word and they think of the FBI or they think of the CIA and they think of, like, I don't know, spies and Bond movies, but I'm not sure most of us really know what espionage is, what the Espionage Act was, and like how it was meant to be used and how it's often used now.
Yeah, and I think also many FBI agents initially imagine that they're going to be investigating high stakes organized crime and spies, and
Right.
don't necessarily imagine that they're going to spend years looking into a case of corn seed theft. I know that was definitely the case with the lead agent in the book, Mark Benton.
So what is espionage? I mean, how was it originally meant to be defined? Like on the legal books, how is espionage defined, and what does it really encapsulate, that word?
So all nations spy on each other for political and national security secrets. That, this is like old game of spy versus spy going back centuries. That is nothing new. And even industrial espionage is not new. One of the first examples of trade secrets theft was in the Greek state of Sybaris, where it was a very decadent society, and people would have these elaborate feasts, and the chefs that cooked at these feasts were highly coveted, and so they would steal the recipes of the chefs that cooked at these feasts were highly coveted, and they would steal each other's recipes, and leading every century since then, there's been some sort of industrial espionage, and then in the past few decades, there has been this move toward criminalizing that. That's something that the United States has really led the way on. And so in the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, we got something called the Economic Espionage Act, which made stealing trade secrets a federal criminal offense for the first time.
Huh. And so is it simply because this, I guess, has like geopolitical consequences beyond just basic individual corporate economic consequences? Because it does seem in some ways like an interesting conflation of actual national security issues versus just we need to protect the interests of our corporations.
I was so fascinated by this when I looked back at the press coverage and the congressional record from the time and the debates that were being had over the Economic Espionage Act. One of the big arguments for criminalizing trade secrets theft and turning it into a federal offense was that the Cold War had led to this surplus of out-of-work spies. And
Weird.
And the intelligence agencies in the U.S. also were kind of lacking motivation. Suddenly the major enemy is no longer, like, the Soviet Union's been disbanded. There's no longer this kind of us versus them mentality, and they really need a new purpose. And the argument at the time was, let's turn economic security into an issue of national security.
Right. And that's where I think a lot of from where I sit, the kind of ethical confusion comes in, right? Because I think sometimes there are like really clear examples where it makes sense that national security and economic interests are almost like two sides of the same coin. And there are other times where it almost seems like that utilization of the law is a stretch, and it's gosh, I don't even really know how to put this into words, which you do so well in the book, but that it's like amplifying the punishment and the crime, and of course, innocent lives are harmed irrevocably because of that.
Right. So U.S. corporations steal each other's secrets all the time. And typically that is dealt with through civil lawsuits.
Mm-hmm.
And what has happened in the past, especially the past decade, has been this shift toward people going to prison for sometimes over 10 years because they targeted another corporation's secrets. And some of these cases sound very dry, but many of them involve the sort of subterfuge that you might find in an issue of more conventional spying. I mean, the case that's really at the heart of this book just drew me in from the first time I read about it. I was living in China at that time, working for Science, and I read this story about Robert Moore being arrested, and he had been found in a cornfield outside Des Moines, where the story said that he was on his knees digging in the dirt. That would turn out to be not entirely accurate, but I got this image of, Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest, where Cary Grant is in a cornfield and being dive bombed by this crop duster from above. Do you know that scene?
Yep. Yeah.
So I had that scene in my head. This is drama of this man in a field digging around while the FBI is on his tail. And, as I later dug into the court documents, it turned out that there were car chases, there were airport busts. There was at one point this attempt to smuggle seeds back to China in microwave popcorn bags. So it's very dramatic and comical in a way, it was sort of like Hitchcock meets the Coen brothers.
Right. Almost like it's just like over the top, like ludicrous, like kind of hard to even envision.
Mm-hmm.
So let's drill down into that, right? Like you mentioned the main player, Robert Ma. Maybe we should start with him. Let's give me a little bit of background on him, maybe before the shit hit the fan, as it were.
Sure. So he's a scientist who had 2 PhDs. He studied thermodynamics, and don't ask me to explain that field. But he's this highly educated man who grew up in China, was born at the tail end of the Cultural Revolution in a fairly poor area, and really reading Sherlock Holmes books as a child. So he loved detective stories, which then becomes apt later on when he's at the center of this like real life spy story. So he gets his first PhD in China, moves to the US to study at a time when many Chinese scholars are coming over to get degrees, and at a time there's also a lot of opportunity. Then he has this classic academic story where he finishes his degree and can't find a tenure track job. So, so he gets a job with his brother-in-law's company back in Beijing, which is an agriculture company, not an area he studied at all, but he needs work. He's has a growing family, wife and kids, and they're living in the suburbs in Boca Raton in Florida. And so he's trying to make a good life for his family. He didn't take the job immediately thinking, I am going to go spend several years stealing corn. Step by step, he gets asked to do more and more questionable things. His boss is like, well, can you just go check out this field and, maybe collect a few samples? And then that turns into hundreds of seed lines. And eventually it turns out that his company, his company is called Dabenong, or DBN, has this plan to get the parent seed lines for at least 100 high quality genetically modified corn seed lines and reverse engineer them back in China.
Right. So it's not just about seed saving and growing from those seeds, but it's also about decoding the tech that was involved in developing these genetic lines.
Yeah, hybrid corn seed, you can't reproduce it by saving the seed. But you can, if you can get at what the parents of a seed line are, you can then make that seed line.
And these are classic transgenic seeds. Like these are what we think of in the US as genetically modified, not just conventionally mixed seeds.
Yes, they are. They are almost entirely genetically modified because most of the corn grown in the U.S. is, and that's not legal in China yet. Companies aren't allowed to commercialize GM corn, but I think there's this anticipation that the government will allow that soon, and that DBN is trying to prepare
So that once it's legal, they're the first to market.
Yes. And so the companies they target are, not just like diddling small seed companies in the Midwest. They go after Monsanto and Pioneer, DuPont Pioneer. What they were called at the time. They've now since been acquired by other companies.
Yeah, they changed their names a lot. But yeah, so these are the big players. These are the guys with lots of lawyers. Yeah, lots of lawyers, as we know. So, okay, this seems like it's tricky, and this seems like probably a pretty dangerous endeavor. But at this point so far, it also seems like a monetary risk. Like, they're putting themselves at risk of lawsuits per se, not necessarily at risk of being investigated by the FBI. So how does the espionage piece come into play?
Well, the FBI learns about this effort fairly early on. In 2011, they get various tips. They get multiple tips of a ethnic Chinese guy in a cornfield, which in Iowa, I guess, qualified as a strange thing. And the Mark Benton, the agent in the Des Moines field office, says, "Oh, it's odd that we've gotten these multiple tips." The FBI actually works very closely with large corporations, including Pioneer, and so they work together on trying to figure out what's going on. Part of the story of the criminalization of trade secrets theft has also been this odd cooperation between the FBI and the private sector. And that's another issue that I raise in the book, that, you have these massive corporations who are often the quote unquote victim companies in these cases. And so in this case, the FBI works closely with Pioneer and Monsanto to catch the culprits.
Right. And so you mentioned that the tips started, at the level of the FBI. So people were tipping off and bringing these tips to the FBI. Were they tips that were observed or gathered by the actual corporations, or was it the FBI that actually brought their attention to the problem?
One was a security officer who, so the thing about Monsanto, for example, is that their fields they're not locked down, like they're not surrounded by fences, but the fields where they do their research, they do keep very good close tabs on them. And so there was the farmer who owned this contract field got suspicious and talked to the security team about that. And then the second tip came from a local sheriff's deputy who was called out to investigate Robert Moe in a cornfield. And because Des Moines is such a small place, his colleague happened to run into someone at the FBI and tell him about that incident. So then Mark Benton starts an investigation. It's called Operation Purple Maze, for reasons I've never been able to figure out, but maybe they're Jimi Hendrix fans. And
right, because there's no purple maze, right?
Right. like Jimi Hendrix in a corn maze or something.
Yeah.
I've thought about it for way too long. And so they, and I went later trying to retrace really all the steps, like the steps that the investigators took, the steps that Robert Moe took. This was multiple years of this kind of cat and mouse game where Robert and his colleagues were driving across the Midwest. They actually bought farms. They posed as farmers in some cases. And then the FBI would be behind them, trying not to blow their cover, because, you have these like vast country roads where, you can just see for miles and there are no other cars.
Except for like the 6, like town cars following you. Yeah.
Right. The guy in dark glasses. No, so actually Mark Benton and his colleagues started to worry about this, about blowing their cover by tailing them closely. So they started surveilling them from the air, using the FBI has this fleet of unmarked airplanes that are registered to fake company names. And so they start flying those over Iowa, in Illinois at this point. Robert and his colleagues are working in Illinois too. And so it just kind of like ratchets up step by step. I never was able to nail down the total amount of money that was spent investigating this case, but I think it is quite large.
So was it all targeted just to this one guy? I mean, he was kind of the thread that was being pulled to try and unravel the entire story and to try and unravel not just what was going on at the company where he worked, but maybe the plot, I guess, that is a larger threat towards trade secrets. Like, was it just all Robert Ma? Like, he was the guy?
Colleagues coming over from China to help. And, there were a number of different players and several people charged when finally the prosecutors charged them. I think it was 6 or 7 people on the indictment. But Robert was the only one who lived in the U.S. full time. And so he was the most vulnerable in a lot of ways. And he was the only one who ended up going to prison in the end.
All right, everyone, let's get back to the show. I think maybe to take a step back from a global view, because just like we were talking about context and kind of pre-established biases that people have in their minds against, technological development in China or against large multinational corporations like Monsanto and DuPont. I think a lot of people have very bad tastes in their mouths about those corps. This is a science podcast. I am very pro transgenic research and development of plants that can, feed growing populations and that can withstand things like disease. So the GM argument is a bigger argument. Whether you have moral issues with the idea of patenting food, that to me is a separate issue than whether you have like a weird moral issue with doing GM research, which to me there's nothing intrinsically moral or immoral about that. That said, people get very emotional about this, and I think sometimes in a black and white thinking way, it's like, oh, Monsanto is evil or DuPont is evil, and so to go after somebody for trying to get a trade secret, that's just a monstrous thing that one of these companies would do. So maybe it's a good idea now to unpack why the business model is what it is and why it actually is illegal to try and reverse engineer a seed that thousands or even millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars went into R&D on.
Sure. Yeah, I was, to be honest, I was drawn to this story in part because it didn't have clear-cut villain and victim.
Right. You used the word protagonist, but you never really said like the hero of the story or the victim of the story.
Yeah, someone called him an anti-hero, and I think that's probably a good description. But
right.
At the same token, Monsanto is not the most sympathetic victim. And for many people, there is this sort of knee-jerk reaction to the name because of its work on GM seeds and patenting seeds and so forth, or patenting traits, I should say. But for me, the bigger issue that I decided was a bigger issue as I reported the book is corporate consolidation. And the agriculture sector is one where there's just been massive consolidation over over the past 20 years, where farmers used to have many, many seed varieties to choose from. And as the companies have been acquired or merged and bought out the smaller companies, the variety of seeds available to them is just really diminished. That becomes relevant for the kind of argument of the book, because the U.S. government takes on these cases to defend innovation and research in America. That is the justification that is given for all of the resources that goes into this effort.
Right. For this being viewed as like national security or espionage. It's because this development matters.
Right. Because, America's an innovative country. We depend on innovation and technology. That is one of our big strengths. And that, the role of the U.S. government here is both to deter trade secrets theft, but also to protect the innovation that happens in America. And when you look at a sector like agriculture, it has actually become less innovative as a result of corporate consolidation over the past few decades. And, to the point where the companies are spending far less on research as a proportion of their sales than they did 10 to 20 years ago.
Interesting. So you see this almost as like an antitrust or like a monopoly issue, that they've become so consolidated and so bloated and big that they don't have much competition anymore, so they don't have to try to innovate.
On some level, it is important to protect against IP theft. Like as an author, I don't appreciate people stealing my IP. I don't want people plagiarizing me, ripping off my work. And certainly we need that protection in place for companies to do what they can do. Like developing a seed line takes 5 to 8 years. And it also takes this whole library of high quality seeds. So one of the reasons that a Chinese company would go to the length of sending people to the US to steal seeds and then, smuggling them back to China. I mean, just all these steps that were taken in this case are very elaborate. That is because in China, they just don't have the foundation of high quality seeds that you would need to breed next generation seeds. So all of this is important. But then when you talk, it was so interesting to talk to intellectual property lawyers, because many of them talked about this balance between protecting IP and also, allowing innovation. Like the two are really not, or they're sometimes incompatible.
Okay. The thing that raises in my mind is sort of the classic pro-GM argument that you often hear. And again, I think sometimes when you're looking at things in a binary or in a black and white way, the arguments become less nuanced and they become more entrenched or fundamentalist. And so one of the things that you often hear, and I think I've actually utilized this argument before, is that the reason that so many farmers choose, let's say, a Monsanto seed over an heirloom seed is because they're more robust. Like if people didn't want to grow GM seeds, they wouldn't. But because their crop yields are higher and because they can make more money, because that seed was modified in such a way to resist, let's say, a blight or some sort of disease and to withstand drought and to, whatever those seeds were developed to do, that's why we're seeing less choice, because the options that have been innovated on and the options that are available to these independent farmers, for example, are just so much better than historical options. Like nobody's forcing them to buy them. They're buying them because they're making more money with them.
Yeah, I think it's partly true, but at the same time, the price of seed has gone up significantly and not necessarily commensurate with the yield, the increase. So I did interview a lot of farmers just in the process of retracing Robert Moore's steps. He came into contact with a lot of Midwestern farmers and seed dealers and so forth. So I went and interviewed all those people. Partway through, I was about 2 years into my reporting when I realized that there was this American farmer in Illinois who had actually been caught in the middle of this whole cat and mouse game. So this guy is a seed breeder named Kevin Montgomery. He had been hired by DBN to do some consulting work on seed varieties, and had a fair amount of contact with Robert. Like they went out to, do you know the Texas Roadhouse? It's a steakhouse.
Hells yeah, I was born and raised in Texas. I've eaten a fair amount of Roadhouse. They have the best rolls with like honey cinnamon butter. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and you walk in and it's just like a big glass case of steaks.
So, yeah. They have a meat cutter on staff. That's their job. They just cut meat.
They would be there. And Kevin, he became pretty friendly with Robert Moll. He was a scientist as well by training, and saw this kind of kindred spirit. And then several months into his work for DBN, he even flew to Beijing to see the lab there and talked to seed breeders there. So he had this incredible insight into what the company was doing. And gradually he starts to have more and more questions, like, this seems a little off, or I don't really get what their plan is for developing this seed line. And then one day the FBI shows up at his doorstep, has a lot of questions for him, and he ends up becoming an informant for the FBI, a very reluctant informant.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder how excited most FBI informants are to be involved in something so risky and so scary, because really they're the ones putting themselves at the most risk, because it's like they're just under constant. I can't imagine what it must feel like to just lie all day, every day. And that's what you kind of find yourself having to do as an FBI informant, isn't it? You have to pretend you're not an FBI informant.
And he's probably the least well-suited person to
oh, no.
He's like scrupulously honest, a little bit long-winded, likes to talk. I owe all my understanding of how seed breeding works to long discussions with Kevin. And he also explained the degree to which consolidation has impacted the industry to me. And so, he really became a central character in the book, and also helped shape my view of some of those areas. But he is just not a generally deceptive guy. And so suddenly he's asked to, not let on that the FBI just spent like 5 hours interviewing him, and just go about his business and report back. And, he didn't blow his cover. But I think he was very relieved when it was all over.
It must also be, I'm trying to kind of empathize with Kevin and think about what it must be like. Oftentimes when we watch like spy movies and we have this idea in our heads of what it means to be an informant, there's a clear right and wrong. There's a clear, that's a bad dude, and we're trying to get that bad dude who has like killed people or who has destroyed lives behind bars, and I'm going to help the justice infrastructure to see justice served. But in this case, I wonder how he was feeling about, like, okay, but Robert's like my friend, kind of, or like this is a guy, like what he's doing is bad, but is he really a dangerous criminal? Like that must have been a strange position to be in.
At that point, I don't think he felt particularly indebted to Robert. He did feel in the end, when Robert was sentenced, I don't want to give away the ending, but Robert went to prison. He did question whether some of that might have been due to Robert's ethnicity, because he knew he'd also told me about all of these crazy examples of like seed breeders stealing into their rivals' fields at night to dig seeds out of the ground. All of this that went on between U.S. seed companies before Chinese companies even got involved. And so, this long history of subterfuge, and it's actually called flashlight breeding, digging up seeds after dark. And so he had that perspective of, in general, like people did not go to federal prison for that in years past. And
Right. So like you said, this was more of a civil litigation issue, or maybe like an FTC issue, like crossing state lines issue. But once you start crossing national borders, that's when it becomes a security issue.
The way it also becomes a national security issue whenever either a foreign company or a foreign national is involved, and that was the case here. Although Robert had lived in the U.S. for many years, he did not get U.S. citizenship, and also he was working on behalf of this Chinese company. And so these cases end up being treated differently than if it had just been like Monsanto versus DuPont Pioneer.
And I mean, on the one hand, that seems arbitrary, but on the other hand, it seems like there is good reason for that, right? Because there's less recourse when you're dealing with an organization outside of the jurisdiction of our own government, right? So if you don't see that as a threat and work in a preventive way, like when trade secrets are lost, they're lost, and there's nothing you can do to get them back.
Yeah, I think that's true if you have mom and pop seed breeder in, Podunk, Iowa. But multinationals have really challenged the notion of allegiance to any country. And
yeah, that's the thing. They're multinational. Do they not have a Chinese component?
Well, certainly Chinese companies have a very unnegotiable allegiance to the Chinese government. To the point, it's very hard for them to separate out from the government. They have to have party officials stationed inside the company, and that's true of agriculture as well as tech. But but multinationals like Monsanto, for example, it was headquartered in the U.S. at the time that this case was brought, but then it was acquired by Bayer, which is a German conglomerate, and so now it's German, and the U.S. government really devoted all of these resources to defending the IP of a company that is no longer American.
Interesting. Well, that's a twist.
It is. I mean, I just found the story I loved the people I was writing about and the characters in the book and the scenes and the drama. There are multiple layers of absurdity that are kind of running throughout. I'm a huge fan of the Coen brothers, and at some point it felt like a kind of version of Fargo involving seeds or something like that.
Right, like this, when made into a movie, would be a dark comedy.
Yes.
Yeah. and the characters would have a ridiculousness to them where you couldn't tell if you love them or hate them.
Yeah, I mean, for example, Robert, I spent a long time corresponding with him when he was in prison, and we talk. At first, he didn't want to talk about his case, so we talked about the detective stories that he loved, and he told me these crazy stories from his childhood, and he told me about he loved to speak in metaphor. He's very kind of over the top view of the world, and it was very fascinating to be able to write the part about him from his perspective, and then to try to do the same with the FBI side of the story, and also with Kevin's side of the story, who Kevin is in a way the more impartial of the three, who's kind of observing this from both sides, which is a very interesting perspective to have.
It makes me wonder, as an investigative reporter, and obviously you can't speak for all investigative journalists, but there is an ethic that goes into basic journalism. which to me in many ways, and I love that you sit with a foot in both of these fields, but it's very similar to the ethic that goes into scientific investigation, which is I recognize that I'm human and I recognize that I have biases. I need to know that first. And then once I know that, I can work as hard as I can to approach this from a neutral perspective. Obviously, we're never going to be able to be fully neutral. That's just the human condition is that we have biases. But that said, I'm wondering what it was like for you and how you sort of worked to maintain a perspective where you weren't prejudging or where you weren't saying, this is my hero, this is my villain, and I'm going to fit them into those categories. Because that's a tall order when you learn new information that makes you dislike somebody you're interviewing, or you learn information or you see something in their personality or their character that makes you warm up to them, for example.
It's true. I mean, you certainly don't want to fit somebody into your preconceived idea of what they're going to be like. But it was fairly easy for me to approach this from both sides, because at the time that I started writing, there had already been several botched investigations that the FBI had done of foreign-born scientists, mostly Chinese-born scientists, and so that had showed that this was not really that there were flawed investigations happening, and at the same time, a lot of the reporting that had previously been done was very kind of like cop and robber. Here are the good guys, and they're going to go out and catch the culprits, and that I think crime fiction in general is a genre that's now being interrogated as people think about how we portray the police and how we portray people who are pursued by the police. And but it just struck me reading previous coverage of some of these cases that the defendants very often had not been allowed the chance to tell their side of the story. And I thought it would be more interesting and a richer book also if I could get into those multiple sides.
And did it change you and your perspective and your opinions of all of these different characters? Like, do you feel emotionally or psychologically different about these individuals than you did when you first set out to write this book?
That's a good question. I mean, I can say that the story gripped me from the time I started the reporting until the end, and that's not always the case. Sometimes you can get bored with the material, but there were so many twists and turns, and it was also a chance to explore a setting from my youth. Like, I grew up in the Midwest, not from a corn farming family, but near cornfields, like partying in cornfields. And then suddenly going through corn mazes as a kid. And then to set something in that space was really compelling to me. But, in terms of the bigger picture, ultimately the United States, especially under Trump, is in this battle between openness and security. And these prosecutions of scientists are happening at a time when much of the U.S. Scientific enterprise is foreign-born, and many researchers especially come from China. And so how we address legitimate issues with trade secrets theft without alienating that section of the population is, I think, a very important question, and one that hasn't been given enough consideration.
Yeah. And I mean, I think even as I kind of pull back and look at it from the widest perspective I can, there also becomes this confusion or this difficulty because we're not just looking at this question of how we approach these trade secrets and this question of like how much we value as a society or as a country these scientific endeavors, because it does feel to me, and I'm interested in your take on this, that it's a bit arbitrary. It's like, does it make us money? Well, then that's something that we really value. But is it, because the pure science is innovative, is impressive, is true, is, fundamental to human knowledge? Well, as a society, I feel like we've stopped giving a shit about that. So there's this weird thing where we're bending over backward to protect some sort of innovation that's built on the backs of hardworking scientists, but at the same time, we're rejecting basic science in our policy endeavors.
Right, or defunding science.
Right.
Yeah.
Like we're like, yeah, we're, going to promote anti-vaxxing, an anti-vax perspective, or we're going to say that masks don't matter during a global pandemic. It's just amazing to me how we can be so contradictory in and of ourselves. And I keep saying we, but that is the royal we, because I do not agree with a lot of these policy decisions. Yeah.
I mean, so more recently, there has been this shift toward the FBI investigating issues involving the theft of research on campus. And often they are looking at basic research. So not necessarily research that has immense commercial application. Cancer research is a very good example, where there's one investigation I looked at MD Anderson, where the FBI spent 18 months on campus shutting down the labs of a number of ethnic Chinese researchers because there was a suspicion that they had taken money from the Chinese government or somehow were planning to transfer technology. And in the end, nobody was charged. And so that's actually in the book because, weirdly, Robert Mo moved to that area and was getting treatment at MD Anderson for a while. And so that allowed me to tell this other story. And I know it doesn't sound like it makes a lot of sense, but I interwove these thriller-like scenes where you have the pursuit across the Midwest and the car chases and the airport busts and so forth, with other a little bit slower paced chapters that were more introspective, looking at issues of scientists under surveillance, investigations on campus, and so forth.
I love that because it really does dive deep into both like this very entertaining true crime, like you said, like you use the word thriller and it has that vibe, but also I think, good literature, whether it be nonfiction or fiction, in this case it's nonfiction literature, it puts you in the seat of questioning your own preconceived notions about something and further developing your own ethical viewpoint of the world. And you require those introspective musings, I guess you can say. And I think that you do a good job of maintaining this well-rounded approach to writing so that you're entertained, you're on the edge of your seat wondering what happens next, but you're also like questioning how you thought the world worked and questioning whether what we think of as justice is just. And I think that that's such an important thing that we have to do as lifelong learners and civic participators.
Well, thank you. I agree.
Well, Mara, I mean, I think that that's a really good place to transition to how I close the show. I ask all of my guests the same two questions, and of course, I think that for people who I like that we left a little bit of a cliffhanger. You want to know more about the story and sort of sew all of these little points that we made together. Buy the book, guys, The Scientist and the Spy, a true story of China, the FBI, and industrial espionage. In these kinds of interviews, Mara, when you're telling a story of something you reported, I am like, I don't know what your answer is going to be to the final two questions that I ask all my guests, because we've been talking about something that's less about your own perspective. Sometimes I think my guests answer these questions during the interview. But for you, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. So here we go. So when you think about the future, in whatever context is relevant to you right now, it could be based on, your newer projects and the reporting that you're doing for what's around the corner, or it could just be like very personal. It could be political, blah, 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 whatever. Number one, what is the thing that's keeping you up at night, that's making you really concerned, that you're maybe even a bit cynical or pessimistic about? And then on the flip side of that, what do you have a true, genuine hope for? What are you looking forward to?
Those are very interesting questions right now.
Right. Yeah.
I think they're all interrelated. For the first question, what keeps me up at night, and what am I worried about? I mean, is there an answer aside from Trump?
Exactly. Like, what is the most pressing? Well, there are literally people, as we know, almost half the country who doesn't feel that way. And that's amazing to me.
That is also worrying.
Mm-hmm. Right. Is it Trump, or is it the people who want somebody like Trump to lead our country that's more scary?
Right. And is it the fact that those of us who believe Trump is cause for worrying all night are maybe unaware of the people who might vote him into office again?
Right. Yeah, and there's so many components of that. I mean,
I did some of the interviews for my book in 2016 in Iowa ahead of the last election, and that was very eye-opening at the time, because I was in Trump country, and I had a lot of interesting discussions with people about him. And I remember one farmer told me, he was talking about how his wife really did not like him, and he was trying to convince her to vote for him. And he said, well, he's just the boss. Like, you don't really have to like your boss. Yeah.
Yeah, my dad has a similar perspective. It's kind of like, well, he might be a jerk, but he's what's best for our country. And I'm like, wow, really? Because I remember one time I was in an Uber a long time ago, I think right after the 2016 outcome. And my Uber driver, I loved his little way of looking at the story. He was like, I just ask people, who would you want to watch your kids? Like, if you had to go on vacation and the only choices were to leave your kids at the Trump's house or at like the Obama's house, like, who would you want to watch your kids, right? Or like at the Clinton house. And it's like, that gives you a lot of insight into what it means to lead a country.
Yeah. And then on the second question, what am I looking forward to? I was planning to have a big book launch / prom, which I can say this because it's a nerdy podcast. I never went to prom. I was going to have my prom finally. I'm looking forward to having it. The place where I was going to have it was affected by the fires in Minneapolis in June, but I'm holding out hope that it will be around, and in whatever 3 years, I'll have a party.
Do you think that it'll be for the next book you write?
Oh, that's slightly depressing to think I have to wait that long. But, who knows? I mean, I might just have a party not connected to any books.
Or maybe for the paperback.
Yes.
That could be cool.
One can hope.
Yeah, I have faith. Mara, this was a fascinating chat. A fascinating story that I was completely unaware of until you did the really hard work to write about it and to offer your insights, your hard questions, your perspectives. So I just want to thank you for joining me. It was really informative. B, tell all of the listeners right now to go out and pick up The Scientist and the Spy. And C, thank all the listeners for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.